Dobra večer, ja sam Branimir Pofuk, a naš gost večeras, i svi to vi dobro znate, je gospodin Markus Zusak. Lijepo vas je vidjeti u ovolikom broju, što je samo znak da ništa ne može zaustaviti ljubitelje knjiga. Posebno knjiga Markusa Zusaka. Pozdravljam vas i u svoje ime, u ime Profila, kojem zahvaljujemo na ovoj prilici, zahvaljujemo na novoj knjizi koja je upravo izašla iz tiskare. Kao što sam rekao prije, dakle, razgovarat ćemo na engleskom jeziku da bismo uštedjeli vrijeme. Ako netko treba, još jednom za ove koji su kasnije došli, upozoravam da na dolje u dnu dvorane možete dobiti slušalice za simultani prijevod. I to je to, krećemo s razgovorom. A ja ću vam kao uvod samo pročitati napomenu autora. Dakle, večeras govorit ćemo naravno i o prethodnim knjigama i o najslavnijoj do sada knjizi Markusa Zusaka, ali večeras predstavljamo knjigu koja se na hrvatskom zove Od kleja most. U hrvatskom prijevodu Saše Stančina, a mi ćemo govoriti s autorom o toj igri riječi, a ja ću vam samo kao uvod pročitati napomenu koju on sam napisao o naslovu. Engleska riječ clay može imati dvojako značenje. Clay kao skraćeno ime Clayton i clay kao glina, prirodni materijal koji se koristi u gradnji, lončarstvu i kiparstvu. Oba su važna za roman Od kleja most. Prvo kao ime protagonista, a drugo zbog prirode gline kao materijala. Ovaj se roman može čitati i ako ovo ne znate, ali ako znate, možda ćete bolje razumjeti Kleja, njegovu priču i njegov most. Uz najljepše želje i veliko poštovanje, MZ. Welcome to Zagreb.
Thank you. Hvala and dobra večer. That's as good as I get.
Okay.
Enough
for the beginning.
And yeah, I just want to say how happy I am to begin with. It's rain. I haven't seen rain like that for a while, and you're all here, so thank you very much. And I did speak earlier to just a small group of people and just said that the first time I ever did something like this, when my first book came out, everyone said, "Oh, it's going to be great. There'll be so many people coming. That it's a great town where you're speaking." And of course, nobody came to the library where I was speaking. And but the best part was that the librarian still made me read from my book, just to her. And so I'm always extra happy when people come. So when you're a writer, you always imagine what the worst thing that could happen is. And in this case, it's nobody coming. But you're all here, so thank you. And it means the world to me. And I'm having the best time here. So thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for coming and traveling half the world to be here. So this is your first visit to Croatia and Zagreb. Mm-hmm. And this is the first stop of your small European, we said earlier, you don't call it a tour, but where will you go from Zagreb?
To Sweden for a few days, and then to Poland for a few days, and then I go back home. So it's a long way to come, but I've gone to some places just for 2 or 3 days, and then back home. So more time actually flying than being in the place. Like I went to Edinburgh in Scotland, and I was just there for 2 days. And so no, this is. And it's actually, it doesn't feel like work. So I'm just, these moments when you're a writer, you start out and you wonder if you're even going to get published, and you don't think you will. And so times like this, it's true when I say to people, this doesn't, when people say, you must be exhausted, you must be tired, and I just say, no, this isn't even work, So it's just an absolute pleasure.
You described in an interview a very nice scene. You sitting in a kitchen with a, I guess, computer, not a typewriter.
Depends on the moment. I think the
Yeah.
one you're talking about, it was probably...
With your daughter.
Yeah.
And when you said something like, can I have some quiet, please, I would like to work. And what did she say?
Yeah, well, I can tell the story. It's that every book has some favourite stories that you have that surround the book. And it's what I've learned now, that in our lives, there's always a story before the story, or inside the story, or surrounding the story. And one of my favourite stories, I have two, one with each of my children to do with Bridge of Clay. And the one with my daughter is that I was sitting doing the very last edits for Bridge of Clay last July, so July 2018. And she was sitting across from me eating breakfast cereal. And I don't know about people out there who have children, but, you know, I don't know, my kids, they eat like barbarians. And I said to my daughter, I said, could you keep it down over there? Because there's cereal outside the bowl, and it's she's making so much noise. And I said, could you keep it down over there? I'm trying to get some work done here. And she just stopped. I can still remember she had the spoon halfway to her mouth, and she stopped and she's just gone, you work? And I thought about that all day. She went to school, I'm thinking about it all day, and then I thought, all right, let's see really what she's talking about. Let's see if it's true. And I don't usually count the words in a book, so when another author says to me, oh, I've written 60,000 words of the book, you know, it doesn't mean so much to me. But I thought, for the first time, I'm going to count how many words there are in this book. And it was something like 128,000 words. And then I divided that by how many days there are in 13 years. And it came out as 1.9 words per day. And not even two. Not even two. And so I thought, yeah, she's actually got a point. But I didn't say anything to her when she came home from school. I didn't say, oh, you were right. Maybe I did, I can't remember. But it's one of my favourite stories about writing that book.
Okay, let's ask immediately, what and why did it take so long?
Yeah, I was having such a good time here until now. It's 13 years to write a book. It feels like a long time, and I should say from the beginning that I'm actually quite happy now that it took so long, because it's a good story to tell. And if things go smoothly, there are no stories. But I think it took me so long to write Bridge of Clay for a couple of reasons. One was that coming off the back of The Book Thief, that was a book that was such a surprise that it did well. I honestly thought that book would be, a real failure, that it wouldn't sell well, that nobody would read it. And so suddenly there was this book that was doing so well. And so I think it's a combination of suddenly you realise maybe you don't have to write anymore if you don't have to. And also, but you have to make yourself happy. But also, Bridge of Clay was always going to be my hardest book to write. It was always the toughest idea. And I tried to write it already in my early 20s, and I wrote the whole book and I realised that's not it. And so I wasn't published at that time. But I knew that wasn't the right book, so I kept it. And so I thought, one day I'm going to write that book. And it was always the next book. But then I realised I had an easier idea to write, and so I wrote the easier book. And then after The Book Thief, there were no other ideas, and so I had to write Bridge of Clay. And so I started, and then 5 years, 6 years went by, and people would say to me, if this book is so hard, just write one of your other ideas. And I would say, that's the problem. I haven't got any other ideas. So I had to stick with it. But people would always also say, you don't have to write a better book. You just have to write a different book. But then again, I said, I've always tried to write a better book. I've always tried. So it was just one of those things. I realised looking back now, I was trying probably, as I've always tried, was to write better than I actually am, you know. And I think the biggest, probably the last answer to that question, and you'll see this is a problem over and over again when I get a question about this book and I know the book so well that 6 answers come up and I don't know which one to take, you know. But the main reason I think that this book took so long was I'd written 4 books or published 4 books before The Book Thief, and they all really meant something to me. But when I finished The Book Thief, I realised that I'd written 1 book that meant everything to me. And I thought, now I want to only write books that mean everything to me. And when you start with that idea, then you've immediately made it harder. And so maybe now that this book is done, which also means everything to me, it might be time to go back and write a book that just means something to me. So hopefully it won't take 13. I don't ever want it to take 13 years ever again. Mainly just because if my dad, who's still, you know, who's 86 years old, everyone could talk to me about that book and say, oh, why is it taking so, or how is your book going? And it wouldn't bother me. But when my dad asked me, it really bothered me because I knew that he was always just making a little bit of fun of me, or it's like someone's sometimes asking you a question and they're just sticking a little pin into you. That was how my dad would ask, and so now I'm just glad that it's done, even though I miss it as well. I miss the characters in the book, and you always mourn it a little bit when it's gone.
But they will be around us and with us here tonight. Let me just mention to you and to everybody here that you have even bigger audience than this. And we say hello to everybody who is watching at this moment live stream on the Facebook page of Profil. So hello to them. You mentioned your father. Your parents had a very important role in creating your the most famous book, The Book Thief. How did they react to that book? And after they gave you your stories and telling you their stories as you were growing up, I guess, all the time, did they have any significant role in the process of writing?
Yeah, again, I have to go straight to the sort of, well, I can start by saying that my mum especially, you know, was so happy that the stories that my mum and dad told me then ended up starting off a book that became something that was quite special. And so it was quite funny though, when I finished writing the book, it was Christmas. I finished in August 2004, and then I had the manuscript just exactly like what you've got there, and I gave it to my mum and dad for Christmas that year. And it was quite a big moment to give it to them, and I remember I even sort of went sort of on my own and I just collected myself because it felt special to give it to them. But I made a really big mistake. I should have given them 1 copy each, because then I rang them on New Year's Day to say Happy New Year, and my dad answered the phone, and after 10 minutes there was no mention of the book. And so I said to him finally, I said, so how's it going reading the book? And my dad said, oh, not too bad, you know, I'm up to page 9. And I said, what, page 9? And I realised it was because my mum was reading it all the time, and so he couldn't quite get his hands on it. But it was quite funny, when I was writing the book, my dad, it's funny because so much of the heart of that book comes from my mum, but the best stories come from my dad about when I was writing it, because he would always be saying to me, so when's the book going to be finished? When's the book going to be finished? It was like revenge on all his children, 4 of us, always asking for an ice cream, over and over again. And so when's the book going to be finished? And I'd say, I'm just having a few problems with the research and getting, things to happen at the right time and place. And he would just say, he would just look at me almost with disgust, and he'd say, just make it up. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Aren't you a writer of fiction? And
how did it sound in German?
That's the other great story,
Okay.
because when the book came out in Germany and it was published, so in German language, I gave him a copy of the German edition, and he said, his exact words when he read the 2 books side by side, and he said, at the end, he said, and this is how my dad gives a compliment, he said, it's not so much, these are the exact words, so I'm sorry, but he said, it's not so much that the book is shit in English. It's just that it's so much better in German. And I said, yeah, thanks, Dad, that's great. The German translator is a much better writer than I am. But actually, when I was so all the little bits of German that are in the book Thief, when I finished it and I'd already given it to my mum and dad for Christmas, I asked my dad then to edit the German in the book. And he was doing such a good job of editing fixing the German that he started thinking that he could edit the English as well. And because the book is written in a unique way, a little bit with Death as the narrator, I especially, and I'm not sure it really comes through in translations, but I especially made Death speak in a way that is like us, but a little bit to the left or to the right of us. And he would, so a good example with what my dad questions me on was, there's a line where it says, the mayor's wife was sitting hunched drunk at the table. And he would say, that's wrong. It should be punch drunk, which is the the common expression. And I said, that's the whole idea, is that I'm taking you to the left or to the right of what you think it's going to be. And also things like, there's one line, or there are many lines all through the book, but the example I can give is when Max, the character of Max, is walking down the street in a procession of Jewish people being taken to the concentration camp in Dachau. And Death describes the sky, and he says, and the sky who was wide and blue and magnificent. And my dad would say, the sky who was blue and magnificent? This is not the correct grammar. Did you learn English at school at all? And I'd say, no, that's how Death speaks. That's exactly how I want it to be, because I want Death to talk about the sky and the earth and the trees and humans too, as if we're all part of the same thing. We're all sort of colleagues in a way. And so it was just, so there was that sort of complication dealing with my dad, but my mum, I think, was just especially, and both of them really are just really proud of the book. And I think it's really important to tell people as well that I probably couldn't have written that book if my parents were older during the Second World War or during World War II, because I think if they were, it would be a very different book. Because I think the fact that they were very young children at that time, or quite young, it's sort of, there was no sense of responsibility for what happened. And it allowed me to write about, really through the eyes of childhood, even though I used Death as the narrator. And that's what made me so free to write the book. And I thought, honestly, it would be, at first the idea was just a kind of memoir or a biography, and because my mum told me all these stories about growing up in Munich, and some of the strongest memories of my own childhood were hearing those stories. We would play in the backyard, we would play cricket and all sorts of things in the backyard, but we would come into the house, and when my mum and dad told their stories, it was like a piece of Europe came into our house. And sometimes I see it like sitting in the kitchen, and it's almost like I can see a train coming into the house, and they told these stories, and so that was how I grew up, and I thought I was going to write just this true story about my mum growing up in Munich, and because Munich in German being München or München, but when they were occupied by American soldiers after the war, they couldn't say München, they said München. and they used to call the lunch hour on the radio, they used to call it Luncheon in München. And I thought that was going to be the title of the book. You know, imagine if the book thief was called Luncheon in München. You know, it may not have been very successful. But that's where you start. You start just with one idea. The idea you end up with is never the first, is very rarely the first idea. And you're just building and building. But now my mum, especially, she still sometimes listens to the audiobook when she drives somewhere or something, you know, and it's, so, I mean, I'm really happy for them because, you know, they came to Australia with nothing. They met in Australia, and
I think that's something I didn't know before, that they met in Australia. Your father coming from Austria and mother from Germany.
Yeah, and my dad was just going to be working in Australia for 2 years, and my mum was staying, and so when he met her, he decided he was going to stay. And you think of all the little miracles that lead to your existence, you know, and my dad was married when he came to Australia, but his wife left him, you know, which I can totally understand. And so then my dad, you know, and you think if she didn't leave him, you know, I wouldn't be sitting here, and for all the little coincidences, none of us would be here, and so it just, you know, so I'm really happy for them. And they couldn't speak English when they came to Australia, and then one of their children ended up becoming a writer, and I know that I became a writer because they had these great stories, and they were great storytellers, and that's why. And the last thing I'll say about that is I'm the fourth of 4 children, and I was spoiled in the way that every spoiled child, it's like the beginning of Anna Karenina, you know, where they say every unhappy family is unique in its own way. Every spoiled child claims to be spoiled in a special way. And I was spoiled because I got to spend the most amount of meaningful time with my mum and dad. So I didn't get their attention when I was very young because I had these older siblings, but then my sisters left home and my brother was off doing other things, and so I would spend a lot of time with my parents when I was 13, 14 years old, and they told me these stories, and those stories ended up being, you know, one of the most important, it was certainly the most important thing in my writing career, and I think they know that, and so they're really proud of the book, even though, you know, they shake it off too. Like if someone says to my mum, "Oh, you must be so proud," and she says, "Oh no, he's just one of my kids," you know. And but then I know it's, you know, I really like seeing the look on my mum's face when she talks about the book.
You told me before that the fact that your parents were speaking German and couldn't speak English when they came to Australia, and that your 2 older sisters actually first learned German, and that you have this mixture of German and English that you speak still at home, that it also made you so curious about words and word plays and putting words together.
Yeah, I like the idea that, and I often talk about writing like it's like climbing a mountain, but there's the promise of a sandpit or a playground at the top. And but you have to do the hard work to get to that point where you're just playing with the words. And that's when I know that a book is working, when I write something unusual and you could even consider it not good English or not the proper English, but it works in the story, or it works for the style of writing that I'm trying to do. And it can be something simple, like on the first page of Bridge of Clay, I repeat something And something that book does a lot is it repeats things, and it's always coming back to remind us of the stories that have been before. But it says that Matthew, the narrator, he goes and finds an old typewriter, and he says he went to an old backyard in an old backyard of a town. And this is not something that you normally do in a sentence, is repeat yourself like that. But I thought, I really like that. I'm starting to play. And so when we had one German word in a sentence and one, we realised that we're speaking our own language. And it's not English, it's not German, but it's a little bit of both all of the time. And so we understand something. And what we're understanding is that it's only us who talks like that in our household. And you can have the same thing reading, like we found even, I was talking to you earlier as well about, I read all the 7 Harry Potter books to my family now. And the rule was that we all had to be there. And then because of reading those books, I would read things in a certain way. I would read somebody's name in the books in a certain way. And so now we still joke sometimes, like there's the character in Harry Potter. I mean, this is the great thing. You don't know you're going to come to Croatia and then start talking about these things. And but I would, every time I read, there's the character, Harry Potter's first girlfriend, Cho Chang. And but I would be reading just normally, but if Cho Chang's name came out, it was always, I'm just reading, and then Cho Chang, and that became part of, if her name is ever mentioned in our household, that is how it is said. And so you have these little jokes and stories inside the stories, and I think I learned that from, you don't realise it at the time, but it's happening around you.
You were joking often about your expectations or having no expectations about the book thief, and like you were saying, how would somebody recommend that book to a friend? Mm-hmm. Like, it's set in Nazi Germany, that is narrator, almost everybody dies, and it has 580 pages, you will love it. Do you have something so short? Can you imagine how would people recommend Bridge of Clay?
That's a really, I should try to find one, and because it's always, I find at least for the first year or two, I'm apologising for a book. And I remember even with The Book Thief, I was always apologising just for the beginning, because at least, one publisher tried to say maybe we should take out the beginning because maybe it's confusing. And a lot of people have said that the beginning of Bridge of Clay is quite demanding because a lot of characters are thrown at you. You're dropped into the world of Clay and his 4 brothers. There are the 5 of them. And their father comes home for the first time in a couple of years. He abandoned them. But I have to find that the exact right way to make it sound like really you shouldn't read the book. And, I guess it would be something like there's a boy who's building a bridge, terrible things have happened to him, and, well, not terrible things, but he's carrying the weight of his family, which is his world, on his shoulders, really. And which again is said on the first page, where Matthew says about his brother, there was one brother of us who took everything on his shoulders, mm-hmm. and that's who Clay is. He feels a real responsibility for the past of the family, and the whole book is about him moulding that past into that bridge that he builds, and that bridge is his life.
You said that you were 19 or 20 when you got that first idea about the boy building a bridge. When did he get the name Clay, and when did he get brothers? Did he have brothers in the beginning, or how was the family Dunbar growing?
Yeah, he originally, I just saw, I was walking around, I was very, in my, from the age of 16 through to my, early 20s, I was very much alone a lot of the time. And I played rugby and I did things like that. So I had friends, but all my friends that I played sport with and things like that, they all went out drinking all the time, and I would stay home and try to write books. And I still see them. Like, there was an event like this near the town where I grew up, and they all came and we had a great time. But at that time, I was very focused on really, and I'm still like that now. Like, I'm not, I have really good friends, but I'm not going out much, and I'm not, which I try to do more because there are so many stories in the world. But I was walking around this suburb where I grew up, and I saw an image of a boy building a bridge, and immediately I called him Clayton, and it was originally going to be called Clayton's Bridge, and then a few months later, and that's the thing that I sort of remind people, is that you don't just have this idea and then you sit down, you start writing. It's almost like you have an idea and it just sits there for a while, or it walks around with you, and then a month or 2 months or a year, 2 years later, another idea comes, which is the next idea. And in this case, it was the idea, no, not Clayton's Bridge. It's going to be called Bridge of Clay. And as soon as I thought of Bridge of Clay, I knew that it was a book. The three first things I think of for a book usually is the beginning, the end, and the title. And I'm always writing towards that title. It's like The Book Thief was always going to be called, from the minute I thought of it as the title, The Book Thief, I'm writing towards that title. And I mentioned...
And not Luncheon and Munchin.
Yeah. And so it was always... So Liesl, this was always a nice thing. At home, I got moved from one part of the publishing house to another because they thought it wasn't really a book necessarily only for teenagers. They thought it was a book for everybody. And so I got moved. And then that publisher tried to make me change. They said, maybe we're thinking a different title. And this is normally the thing that happens when your book gets published in America. They want to change the title. And so I've never yelled at anybody in the publisher, but I thought, I saw this on email, and so I rang straight away, and that publisher, she wasn't, I can say this now because she doesn't work there anymore, but because she said, and it was a kind of annoying thing that she said, let's talk about this soonest. And there was something about the word soonest that really bothered me. and so I rang straight away, and she wasn't there. She'd gone out, she'd left work for the day. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I said, right, I wrote an email then saying, if you want me to change the title, and it was very late in the process. I said, if you want me to change the title, I said, sure, I can consider changing the title, but I just need 2 weeks to go through the book and take all references out to Liesl being the book thief. And then so I took the 2 weeks and I came back, I said, I can't change the title. And so in the case of Bridge of Clay, as soon as I thought of that title, I thought of the idea of clay and that he's moulding his life into the bridge. And there were no... and when I wrote that version when I was 22 or 23 years old, it just didn't work. He had a sister and he had a brother. Mm-hmm. And he was living more in a small town. And then when I started again more than a decade later, I had the idea then, no, he lives in a big city. And he's going to go out to the country to build this bridge. And his father has left them. And so it started to come together. And I thought, I don't want to write an easy book. I mean, I don't know what's wrong with me. But I thought, does he have a brother? Does he have a sister? And I went, no, he's one of 5 brothers. And that immediately makes it harder because you're juggling all these characters all the time. You've got all these balls in the air that you have to keep up all the time. And then I knew originally there was going to be like a dog, and there was going to be a cat and a goldfish. And I actually thought then, for a very specific reason, which I won't tell you now, which I can't really, it really ruins the book for anyone who does then read it, but I thought, no, they actually own a mule, And it's one of the things you learn writing a book, that a mule and a donkey are two different things. But they owned a mule. And then I thought, okay, so how do they own a mule living in the city? And then I thought, this is because often horses from Europe come to Australia for a big race in Australia, the Melbourne Cup. And often these horses, they used to come, but they had a little travelling companion, like a Shetland pony or something. And I thought, there's this mule, and it used to be a companion to a famous racehorse, and they ended up, that was the original idea. But then I thought, no, they just live in a racing part of Sydney. And all these little things, it's always the little things in the book that are true. And there's a moment in Bridge of Clay where the brothers end up buying a mule for their youngest brother who loves animals. And he already has a dog, a cat, a goldfish, and a pigeon. And they end up, the last thing they get him is a mule. And because it's sort of like making up for the loss of both of their parents. And but where I grew up, not far away, and where I lived for a long time, right near the railway tracks, there was a small field. And in that field, there were two horses, and there was a sign on the fence, and it said, anyone caught feeding these horses will be prosecuted. And the funny thing was that that anyone was spelt wrong. It was spelt E instead of A. It was spelt E-N, which is phonetically correct. Yeah. But prosecuted was spelt correctly, which is a much more difficult word. And that small moment is in the book. And it's all of these little things. You're building up the belief that these five brothers have a mule standing in the backyard all the time. And often they leave the back door open. So I always knew the beginning of the book was their father was going to come home, and they have this nickname for their father, which is the murderer. And when he comes home for the first time in 2 years or 3 years, he comes in, and standing in the kitchen is the mule. And he realises that his whole world has changed in the last couple of years. But I have to admit now, I can't even remember what the question was. And this is the thing when you start talking about a book and you see everything that you've put into it, and it all comes up in front of you. Yeah. And but yeah, now I know. It was always going to. I think I remember now. Yeah. 5 brothers, and then I realised that then I wanted to tell the story of their parents as well. And so at one point I realised that the mother of the 2 boys was going to come from Eastern Europe, and the father was going to come from a country town in Australia. And so it was as much about not only Clay and his brothers, but also the stories of their parents as well.
The decision about the mother coming from Eastern Europe, was it made before or after you met your girlfriend and future, and now your wife from Poland?
Definitely after, because again, it's always the small things that I hear. I always laugh. I don't laugh. That's not fair to say. But I'm not one of these, like sometimes I hear writers talk about, I listen in on people's conversations and, because that's where, I don't listen into people's conversations because I think it's kind of rude. and I don't, and I'm not watching people all the time, but I know it when I see it and I know it when I hear it. And so it's just being a little bit aware. My wife, she came to Australia when she was 6 years old from Poland. And so her parents made the decision. It was in 1982. But in 1981, they left Poland. They were in Austria for 6 months. And then they came to Australia. And it's not so much just those big facts. It's the little things. And so my mother-in-law, she said, there were 2 big moments. And when I say big moments, one was just a small thing where she said, in my whole life, leading up to the point where I came to Australia, I'd never seen a cockroach. And when she got to Australia, where they lived for the first 6 months, you know, there were cockroaches. And she said the first thing they bought in Australia, because it was so hot and because of the cockroaches, was a can of fly spray and flip-flops. And that's the first, and it's just these little things. And but she also said that for the first 6 months in Australia, she cried every day, you know, and because she missed home. And I said to her that when she went back to Poland for the first time, I said, "What was it like when you went back?" And she said, "You know, everyone just thought we were rich now. Everyone thought that everything was easy, and we lived in a free country, and so we were wealthy, and you know, everyone just wanted, everyone expected them to be just giving money to everyone or gifts to everyone." And I said to her then, did you tell them how hard it was when you first came to Australia and you had very little, and that you were so shocked by the heat and how you had to work really hard? And she said, you know, no one was interested in that. You know, no one really wanted to know that. And so I think I became very interested in the idea of there's this it looks like this paradise, but you have these struggles in paradise as well. You know, especially when you arrive and you're foreign to that paradise. It's also a kind of hell as well. And so I wanted that to be. I realised when I heard those stories that was going to be part of the world, and it was something that I related to because of my own parents' stories.
Because Penelope is the character, she's bringing the most important heritage to Australia. 2 books. By Homer, piano. I like that in a special way because she's playing Mozart and Chopin. 2 books and piano. And there is one more book that you made up that is part of the family wealth.
Yeah, it's so much like The Book Thief. And I don't, in every book that I've ever written, there are always books inside the book. And all of my characters, no matter, even if they're not very well educated, they always read. And I didn't realise that I was doing that. But it became, what happened, the way the idea of Homer first came into the book, and the Iliad and the Odyssey was... And
that's where all the names of the animals came from.
Yeah, exactly. And originally the animals it was even more ridiculous, you know, that there were 2 cats instead of one. I had to cut one cat out, and that was the cat called Cyclops, and then one cat was called Agamemnon. But then I thought, it's such a stupid name for a cat,
but not for a fish,
but not for a goldfish. and that was always there was a line in the book that I'm not sure if it was always in, and then I took it out, where the brothers, they're all so mad at Tommy, the youngest brother, for naming the animals these ridiculously hard names. And they said with Agamemnon, God, thanks a lot, you know, how about a name we can pronounce? You know, why don't you call the animals, you know, totalitarianism or, you know, phenomenon or something, you know, these hard words to say. But it came because all these brothers... Every time I talked about them, I was giving them, because Australian people, and I think every culture has nicknames. Every culture has, you know, these names. And so I'd given the brothers nicknames. Like Clay was the Smiler, because he was the one, I had this idea that he would smile after he was beaten up, you know. And Matthew, the oldest, is the responsible one. Rory is he's the human ball and chain, because he's the really tough one. You know, he's like undefeatable, and so on. And Henry was the friendly one, or the money maker. And so I thought, and so what I realised at some point was that I was writing a kind of suburban epic, where it's about we all think we live these dull, small lives. You know, and we do in a lot of the time. But then, you know, we all have people die on us, You know, we all fall in love. We all have big arguments in the kitchen sometimes. And so sometimes our lives are bigger than us, bigger than what we realise they are. And I wanted to write about, I think, those times and those moments. And so I made these characters sort of heroes of this suburban life. And so all the kids who are there with the brothers at the start of the book, they all have nicknames. But then it was when I thought of the nickname of Penny, of Penelope, that she was a many-named woman. And even just that expression, a many-named woman, is again that unusual use of language. And then I thought, okay, well, what are the names? And then it was so hard because she's called the mistake maker, but in Polish, that such a word would never really be used.
But could be invented, like translator did a great job with creation, Mr. Stanchin. This word griešilica, he translated mistake maker.
Yeah,
and
right.
It is very similar to musical marks, because, you know, the marks for flat, B flat, you know, we have in musical terms povisilica, snizilica, and now griešilica.
Yeah,
It's completely in the spirit.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, and any kind of invention like that is always nice to hear. Yeah, so then I got the idea then that she's got that nickname, and then they would call her the birthday girl in one place where she stayed, and then she called herself the broken-nosed bride because she breaks her nose in a car accident the day before her wedding, and so on. And so that was where I really came to the idea that she would bring a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey to Australia that her father gives her in English, because he understands that's going to be the language she speaks. And then, of course, the other book is a book I made up, which I did in The Book Thief. With pretty much every book inside, The Book Thief is made up, but has a title that is quite specific to the part of the book that it's about. Yeah. And so there was one book called The Quarryman, which is a book, it's like a biography of Michelangelo, and that's the book that comes from his father's story. And those three books inside Bridge of Clay.
It sounds so interesting that I was looking for that book already on Amazon. I would like, but I didn't find it. Very important object on the beginning of the story is a typewriter. And I was looking for the covers of your other editions. I haven't seen anything like this. How do you like this?
I love it. Yeah, the typewriter is, I think, because it's really at the end of the day.
Because the boys here sitting on the typewriter, usually they put him on the roof as he is sitting in the book on the roof.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and in this way, the typewriter is the roof, and the typewriter is the bridge, and so I really love that in this case, because it's a book about, and I think just as The Book Thief is, it's a book about how important stories are to us. That's really what the book is about, that we start becoming who we are long before we're even born, and that there are stories inside us just waiting for us to discover them. And that's why the idea of digging up the typewriter at the start of this book, it was after I'd already been writing the book for 6 years. And there's a moment in part 3 where Michael Dunbar, the father of Clay and the brothers, he's growing up in a very small town in Australia where it's really hot, and he comes home from school one day and his dog has died. His dog has had a fight with a snake, and they're both dead next to each other, and he buries them next in the backyard, friend and foe next to each other. And then I just had the idea when I quit the book. At this point, I quit this book twice. And the first time for less than 24 hours. I quit the book. I went, that's it. I'm going surfing. And so I went, and my friend who I go surfing with a lot, when I quit the book, he said, that's great, we can surf more. and then I came home and I was reading books that I love, but I thought, God, if they can do that, I can do this. And then I thought, let's scrap the beginning, how it was. And I thought, Matthew was originally sitting on the roof telling the story, and I thought, maybe he's sitting, I thought, yeah, let's put him in the kitchen, my favourite room of the house, of any house. And so much of the family history happens in that kitchen. When their father comes home for the first time, he's in the kitchen. When their mother tells them when they're young that she's going to die, it's in the kitchen. And so many things happen in that kitchen, and the stories that are told are often in the kitchen. And so I thought of that, and I thought, right, he goes, he's typing. You don't know where the idea came, but I thought he's typing on a typewriter now. That's how he's telling the story. And I thought, he's gone out and he's got the typewriter from out. I thought, oh, when Michael Dunbar's mother died, which was already going to happen in the book, I thought, she used to be a receptionist or a secretary at the doctor's surgery in the small town. And it's one of my memories of childhood. It's not the same now. I think our children are not getting the same experience, but you would go, if you went to the doctor, there was always someone punching on the keys of the typewriter really hard, and I thought, that's his mum. And when she dies, Penelope says to him, are we going to take the typewriter? And he says, no, I've got a better idea. And he buries the typewriter in the backyard with the snake and the dog. And so and Clay knows the story. Clay's the only one who knows the story. And at the end of, when everything is finished, he tells Matthew the story, how their father once dug a typewriter in the ground. And he says, and you're the one who's going to write the story one day. But when you dig the typewriter up, you've got to be really careful, because if you get it wrong, you're going to dig up the dog or the snake. And of course, Matthew, when he digs up the typewriter to tell the story, he digs up the dog and the snake first. And he says, it was, and in English, and I don't know how it translates, but in English he says, it was perfect, pirateless treasure. And the word pirateless doesn't exist. But the idea of treasure and pirates, but going to this country town that is like a desert, it just is the right expression. And so again, I was playing with the words, which felt right.
You liked very much, you told me today, this black, those black stripes here on the cover. By the way, it's designed by 2M Studio. And then you showed me something from this notebook. What is this notebook that you have here?
Most books, when I write a book, it usually takes up all of my ideas that go into it usually takes up one or two notebooks. This is the 14th notebook for Bridge of Clay. It's the last one, and so, but every time, and I have real habits and routines and rituals, and so I'm always writing. I always put a border in the on my notebook page, or else it feels wrong. I have all these strange habits, and but a page like this is the way I organise a book is I'm always writing. This is actually usually this book doesn't have many, but usually I'm writing all of my chapters down one after the other. There are 100 chapters in Bridge of Clay, and when I haven't written for a few days or a week, if I haven't done much work or because of other reasons, I sit down and I write the chapters out. And I do this over and over again. I must have done this exact list, but with small changes, of course, just trying to get it right. There would be over 1,000 lists like that to get everything in the right order. And to use the Book Thief again as an example, you're writing this list and you see, if you look from the first list to the last list, you see all the changes. So a chapter there's the chapter in The Book Thief where Hans Huberman gives a piece of bread to the man walking down the street on his way to Dachau. That was always going to happen in part 4. By the time I'd done all my lists and I was writing the book, and I do it while I'm writing the book all the time, it ended up happening in part 7. and so that's why I'm doing it. I'm always getting to know the book as I'm writing it. And you need to know just enough to start, and then you get to know it as you're writing it as well.
I liked very much when I saw that you name the chapters that remained in the book. You call them survivors.
Yeah.
So how many chapters and maybe characters you killed in the process?
There are a lot. In this book, I mean, there's already a cat that's gone. There was the first narrator there's a character called Carrie Novak, and in some way, it's kind of, I just realised that only just struck me now, that it's a more grown-up relationship like Liesl and Rudy in the Book Thief. And it's a much more quiet, understated friendship that Clay and Carey have. But the original narrator of the book was a girl called Maggie, and she was Carey Novak's sister. And that was for 6 years. And then I said, it's not working. I need to change. And so I cut her out of the book. And that's like cutting your hand off. But it had to be done. And you don't know, the thing is, you don't know when it's going to come back and be useful. It's like in the book before The Book Thief, called The Messenger, or I Am the Messenger. There's a dog in that book called the Doorman, who sits at the door, and he's one of my favourite characters that I've written. And he was in a book that I tried to write about a writer who was struggling writing a book, and he had this dog sitting at the door. And he wouldn't move even when you opened the door, so he would just move with the door. And I wrote 30 pages of that book, and it didn't work. But then I started writing this other book, and I went, oh, that dog. I'm going to bring him from that book into this book. And so you don't know. That's why I say just always keep things that you write, because you don't know when it's actually going to be useful. Just because one thing fails as a whole, it doesn't mean it doesn't have good things in it. And so Maggie, I think, is the beginning of my next book.
Ha. There is an idea already.
Yeah, I think, I'm not a writer I never want to hide things from the world, or from, that sounds a bit dramatic, but I don't hide things from people, and when people say, oh, what are you doing, how's your book going, and and I'll tell them how badly it's going, or I tell them, and they say, what's it about, and so I tell them what it's about, and so I can tell you really what the line is that, and is going through this new book. But originally, one of the reasons that that Bridge of Clay took quite a while as well was in those first 6 years. Maggie was putting together, she was good at doing jigsaw puzzles. Mm-hmm. And so every chapter had all these pieces in it, and it was like she was putting a puzzle together. And I just thought now it's a slightly different idea, where she is a character who has come to put people back together. And so the idea is that the prologue of Bridge of Clay used to be called The Jigsawist. And I thought maybe that's the idea for the next book. But because her sister was a jockey and her parents don't want her to be a jockey, I thought of this idea.
Don't say too much.
I can say a little bit. And I got the idea. This is all I'll say. I got the idea because there was a horse in Australia, a very quite famous racehorse, and it was like my favourite kind of racehorse. It's a grey colour, and he was a sprinter who won so many races, and then went to Hong Kong and raced which is very hard to win in another country, and then won in Hong Kong, came back to Australia, and then suddenly, at the start of the horse race, had the gates open and the horses all jump together, they come out, and suddenly this horse stopped And it's actually very difficult for a horse to hold. It's harder for a horse to stand still than to jump in that situation. But this horse just stopped altogether, just said, no, not racing anymore. and then that's where I got the idea. And the horse had a great name. The horse's name was Chautauqua. And I got this idea that here is this girl and this horse, and she's the only one who can make the horse jump out of the gate. And so when they take away, you know, when they think we're going to put a really good jockey on the horse, that jockey can't get the horse to run, but she can. And that's the beginning of the idea. But that only happens halfway through the book.
Yeah.
You know, I'm already thinking of where it begins.
Because this what you described has origin here, actually horses. And let me just tell you that, and a small warning to other readers in Croatian, Keri Novak, it's written the way it was written with C at the end. In Croatian we have that word novac, and it means money.
Yeah,
and for
right.
half of the book I was wondering why did they translate this name and why did he give her the name Carry Money? When I realized when you brought her family that they are Novaks,
Yeah,
it's
right.
Novak family.
Yeah, it was a name that just struck me as the right name. And I didn't know. Had I known that there would be a problem in the Croatian translation, I would have changed it.
Yeah, we could speak, I guess, for hours about each of the name of Dunbar brothers, Matthew, Rory, Henry, Clay, Tommy. You said something about them, about the names of the animals. I will, before giving the microphone and opportunity to the audience, I will just ask you one more question. I heard one interview when you were saying about some details and you mentioned that you were talking about your life, and you mentioned that your father is an addict for Tic Tacs, and he always has Tic Tacs in his car. And there is a situation where you were, as a young boy, into athletics very much. So that's all happening also in the book. Tic Tacs is always in the family car. So when your father read this book and your family, because there are many bits of your life and your relationships. How did they react, and did you have to be especially considerate towards your family when writing? And
I think it's always, when it's small details like that, I think people love discovering themselves in your book. But if it's becoming more personal, you feel like you want to ask if it's okay. And so I think sometimes you need to be careful about what you're putting into a book. And it's like I had the idea, like someone told me a story about going to Florence and seeing the statue of David and touching the statue, as like a long time ago. And I always thought that was going to be the idea until I went and saw the statue. Saw the statue of David, but I was more interested in what I realised is that you go to see David, and inside that museum or gallery, it's like he's in this dome of light. It says he's like royalty, and leading on the way are these other sculptures that he didn't finish. And they're called slaves or the prisoners, and that's very important to this book. And I thought my character so someone will tell you something, but then the characters become themselves by when you see what you need to see for them. So what usually happens in a book is that even if you use somebody else's story that they've told you or a character, is you make enough changes that it's almost unrecognizable, or it's a whole new idea that you've taken it from the real to a new imagined truth. And so my idea was that Clay would have an idea of the statue of David and say, I would love to do something like the David. Or actually his father, when they're talking about the bridge and making a beautiful bridge, his dad says, I'd love to make something beautiful and perfect and great like the David someday. And Clay says to him, but we actually lived the lives of the slaves. And I feel like that's how we all live. We want this sort of perfection, but we're actually still becoming, and we're still fighting our way out of the marble. And I think that's actually not a negative idea, it's actually a beautiful thing. And I actually prefer those sculptures to the actual David, I think.
Like wonderful fails. I will not start now this story. I love the story, maybe at the end. The time is flying with you. Thank you for now. Ima li tko pitanje? Evo, mikrofon je, ja se spremam maknuti ovaj mikrofon i proslijediti ga vama. Samo dignite ruku i neko će vam donijeti mikrofon. Itko?
This is always the most nerve-wracking moment.
Yeah.
Usually, often I used to speak in high schools, and people would say, "Are there any questions?" And one hand would come up, and the question was, "Can we go?" so I don't worry if there are no questions, and I know when I'm in the audience, my heart beats really badly when I ask a question.
Evo.
Yes. Thank you for taking pity on us.
Hi, thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you, where did you draw your humanism, optimism, positivism, especially in the book Thief? It's such a huge tragedy and so little humanism at the time. So where did you draw it from? Is it from your family? Is it from love and care you got in there? I'm asking because, you know, the times are tough even now, and a lot of blackness around us. So I'm wondering, where are you getting it from?
I think it's a really good question, and it was a combination of things. It's always, it's never just one thing. And I think it was just that I realized that, you know, what I realized I was hearing when my mum and dad told me stories growing up, that there was still moments of humor in their stories. Like my mum said when, you know, and they realized, my mum and dad said, you know, we might have been poor after the war or during the war, or there was no food, or there was no, but we were still the lucky ones, you know, compared to what happened, you know. But she, you know, but my mum would say we had to run to the bomb shelter in the middle of the night, you know, early hours of morning, and she said, but all my sister cared about was taking her hair curlers, you know, and it's those little details, you know, where I thought people still find unusual things. Or, you know, and it was the story, you know, where my mum said that the people were being taken down the street to the concentration camp, and it was a teenage boy who caught up to the last person who couldn't keep up and gave him a piece of bread. And so I think it's because you see the glimpses of the light in those kind of stories. And so in that way, sometimes those extreme times, or, you know, like during World War II and Holocaust, is that there are these moments of beauty that I think are bigger because of how dark the times were. And that's why I feel like that time is like a well that is never going to run dry, that there will always be these kind of extraordinary stories. And it also came from just the idea of using death as the narrator, where he was writing about colours in the sky. And what I realised is that when he's talking about those colours in the sky, and that he tries to notice some moment of beauty at this time of death, what I realised is that that's also what the book Thief is actually about, is finding those moments of beauty even in the worst times. And, you know, I didn't know I was doing that when I was writing the book, but I'm always looking for these moments in anything I'm writing. And so in Bridge of Clay, in the book, in anything, I'm writing towards those moments. And I think maybe at the end of the day, I am an eternal optimist. Yeah, but I walk around and in my day-to-day life, and the book is terrible and it's not working, but there's something in me somewhere, even when I quit, you know, I've quit the book, I can't work on it anymore, I don't know what I'm doing, but I always think I'm going to wake up at some point and I'm going to say, now I'm going to do it. And so maybe I have too good a belief in human behaviour, but I still think that there's a point where we still find the best of ourselves, and especially in the hardest times, you know. That's what I hope anyway. But whether that's naive, I don't know, because we seem to be going down that track all the time. But, you know, we also find, I mean, in Sydney on Friday, the day before I left to come here, you know, there were so many people at the climate change strike, and you know, so many children and so many, and you know, and for the first time then there were so many people left work, you know, and so finally, you know, not only were children on strike, you know, their parents were, and people left work as well, and so you start, you know, and it was actually really quite beautiful, and so you start to see these little glimpses of hope, and that's what we have to find, I guess, is what I believe. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Još mikrofon tamo, gdje se još neko pravio. Ako ne, donesite meni mikrofon. Možda bi neko stvarno mogao već skoro pitati, možemo li ići.
That's really nice message, and that's why I will ask you the final question, or actually I will ask you to tell the story that I like very much. Because the fact is that we as humanity, humans, failed so many times, obviously. And it's always the question, when are we going to learn, or are we going to learn anything? And you have that wonderful story. You like very much to quote Samuel Beckett, fail again, but fail better. Mm-hmm. And you have that wonderful story about 3 fails. I would like you to tell the story and how it brought you to strive even more to perfection. And
so, sorry, 3 fails?
3 fails with discus.
Oh, yeah, yeah, okay. So, yeah, when I always think I was 8 years old, but I might have been a year older. But I did, and it's funny because at home I played rugby, and I mean, look at me, you know, I'm not very big, you know, it's a wonder I survived. But in summer we did athletics, and my best event was the discus. And again, I was only small, but I was taught to have really good technique. And so I went to the next championship from, you know, went from just where I did athletics to the next step higher. And I got to the ground, and I was only going there for one reason, and that was to win, you know. But I got, and suddenly, you know, yeah, they have the cage around the disc, or the net around and I'd never seen that before, because where I did it, there was no net or cage. Everyone just had to watch their heads, you know. You know, that's one of the best things about growing up in the 80s. No one cared so much about safety, and so it's one of the things that I really hate, you know, the trampoline. You know, and when we were kids, you jump on the trampoline, there was no net to catch you, you know, and if you fell off, you just fell off. And, you know, and that was great. So I'm going, see how there's always another story, because we had a trampoline at home, now my kids, so I'm not even telling the discus story. But one of our dogs jumped up onto the trampoline and ate the protective thing around the springs. And so we just pulled the whole thing down, and so now if our kids fall off, that's it. That's their bad luck, and which is good, because you actually have to pay attention. But anyway, at this athletics championship, I got in, and I was so overwhelmed by the net that I got in and I did the spin, you know, with the discus, and every time it just went straight into the net. I could hear the noise, the awful noise, and I was so upset, and I was crying, and one of my sisters was there, and my brother was there, and then my dad came from the distance because he was helping out at one of the other events, and he could see that I was upset. He's like, "What happened?" You know, and my sister just yelled out, "3 fouls!" But what that taught me was then the next year I went, and I really bothered my dad over and over again in the weeks leading up. I said, "You've got to take me to the field to practice inside the net," and so I went there. He took me there, and it started raining like the rain tonight. But I just stayed, and I threw, and I kept throwing, and then I got to the championship the day, and I can't remember anymore if I won, but I know that I went in even to the next level, and it was just that failure I'm so grateful to that failure because you know, it taught me to prepare better next time, and that I had to find a new way, or I had to practice, and it's the same with writing. You know, it's always, you think you're failing, but you're not really. You're just, it's like everything else you do. I mentioned surfing earlier. Every time you go surfing, it's like training for the next one. And writing, it's like every book is its own thing, but it's your training to write the next book, and hopefully you think you will learn from your mistakes, and so maybe that means it won't be 13 years to finish the next book, but we'll see. But you know, I've been so lucky, and I remember somebody, because I did tell that story about failure once, and then I was interviewed on radio, and someone said, "You know, how dare you talk about failure? You know, you've been successful and everything." And I always try to think of what's the opposite. If you know, would you say someone who's considered a failure that they're not allowed to talk about success? You know, so I think it's important to understand that, you know, part one of The Book Thief, it took, you know, I read and reread and rewrote 150 to 200 times to get that right. And nothing ever works the first time. And you're always looking and searching, and you say, "That's not it. That's not it." You spend so much of your time as a writer saying, "That's not it." And then when you find it, that's what... But you've used everything that didn't work to find the one thing that does. And so nothing really is a failure. Every attempt brings you closer to the moment where it really comes together. And if you're really lucky, then, you know, you get to have nights like this. And, you know, and you're such a polite audience. If this was in America, everyone wants to ask a question because everyone wants their moment, you know. And but I understand, because I'm always too nervous to ask something. But you know, I've had such a great time here. Everyone has been so warm. Everyone's, you know, treated me, you know, like a long lost son, you know. And and I think that's what everyone and I think that's what these boys in this book are looking for. And you've made me feel that. So thank you. I'm so privileged to have been here tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
Hvala vam još jednom svima na dolasku. Hvala gospodinu Zecu ovdje koji je prevodio. Sada će Markus dolje, možete i Kraljevicu knjiga, novo predivno izdanje, i od Kleja Most možete kupiti ovdje večeras po posebnoj cijeni sa 20% popusta. Markus će naravno i slikati se s vama i potpisivati knjige. I zahvaljujemo Hrvatskom državnom arhivu na ovom predivnom ambijentu u kojem smo bili. It was so special to be in the place where all these books are kept.
Thank you, Marcus. Take your time, but come back with your new novel here to Zagreb.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, thank you for sitting down so long. Thanks for doing such a Oh, yeah? Okay. Sure.